What if wasting energy was actually a secret to living longer?
In our discussion today was inspired by a YouTube comment. This particular comment asked if we could do a deep dive on uncoupling to survive, which was a paper from the year 2000.
But uncoupling to survive sounds pretty important because the word survive is in there. Pull down the electron transport chain and they're gonna go through this turnstile that's called the ATP synthase. Boom, energy.
To have some mitochondrial coupling, it's basically a proton leak. This proton leak accounts for roughly 30 to maybe even up to half of your resting metabolic rate. You're not carrying a lot of extra load, so you can think of walking as being more or less mitochondrial coupling versus like rucking.
What if wasting energy was actually a secret to living longer? What if your body had this hidden switch that could burn more energy, protect your cells, and slow down the aging process? Today we're diving into mitochondrial uncoupling. This is a process that sounds counterintuitive, but may actually hold the key to better metabolic health and longevity. From how it changes the way our cells actually make energy, ATP, to why scientists are calling it a potential anti-aging breakthrough, we'll unpack what uncoupling is, how it works, and whether it's something we can safely harness for our health. You are listening to Beyond Healthspan, a podcast that strives to decode longevity research to live better, longer, without the guesswork. We focus on more than just aging, explore fascinating science shaping the future of human health, advanced strategies and breakthroughs that impact quality of life, as well as holistic well-being. I am your host, Brandon, Senior Health Coach from the clinical team at Healthspan, joined by my buddy Rich, Senior Scientist, and also one of our Senior Health Coaches. We are excited to dive into our topic this week, the prowess of uncoupling by mitochondria. Rich, hi. Good to be with you here as usual. What was the impetus for today's topic, if you want to intro this for us?
This episode and our discussion today was inspired by a YouTube comment, and we're so grateful for it. This particular comment asked if we could do a deep dive on uncoupling to survive, which was a paper from the year 2000. There's been additional research done since that time, and we're going to dive into that. This is, by all purposes, this is a extension or an addition to our previous video. A comment from that we're looking at now was on a mitochondrial health or mitochondria function 101 discussion we had previously, Brandon. We do care and we are so grateful. We appreciate a ton that someone would spend the time to hang out with us and listen to our podcast. It means even more that you'd reach out to us directly. So we did move this up. We had plans to discuss this topic, but we've moved it up the list, prioritized it, and tried to get around to it as soon as we could as a result of this comment. So thank you. And I'm excited to get into it today. We covered the mitochondria 101 content more in that previous video. We're not going to talk about the origins of mitochondria and some of the basic stuff. We'll be getting into deeper context on the uncoupling side of things. So we'll dive right in.
Yeah, it also made a lot of work for us. We had a lot of fun diving into this topic over the last week or so. I think there's some really cool stuff that came out of it. But uncoupling to survive sounds pretty important because the word survive is in there. We know that uncoupling involves the mitochondria, which one of their many tasks is to create energy, and that's probably the most important task. But if we're talking about energy, it seems like you'd want to be more of a Lamborghini and cranking out ATP and energy versus something that's more conserving energy, like a Toyota Corolla. What came to my mind was Family Matters, where Steve Urkel had the Urkelmobile, which was enough to barely fit him. But Rich, if you want to give us a little background into uncoupling and what it means before we get much further into this.
Yeah, the term conjures up a lot of importance, right? With the word survival built in. So we took a look at this. I've heard about mitochondrial uncoupling for quite a while. In fact, my dissertation work, I had another friend and colleague by the name of Vin Miller, who was very interested in mitohormesis and mitochondrial uncoupling. Some of his work associated with the study that we were doing at the time was focused on that topic in particular. Admittedly, he's probably smarter than I am. So when he was talking about mitochondrial uncoupling, gloss over or plug my ears and run away. But I was really more focused on some of the other nutrition performance elements of that particular study. However, it was really cool to learn more about that alongside as he kind of taught me and brought me up to speed. It's awesome to get a refresher here in this case. So let's talk about the role of mitochondrial uncoupling necessary to life to have some uncoupling. You don't want too much, you don't want too little. So we'll kind of start there. Survive is probably not a misnomer. It's probably not hyperbole, right? You need to have some mitochondrial coupling. It's basically a proton leak. This proton leak accounts for roughly 30 to maybe even up to half of your resting metabolic rate. The energy that you require just to be here, Brandon, just to sit there and hang out with me, then your resting metabolic rate would be 30%, 50% determined by mitochondrial uncoupling. So it's crucial, it's huge. And your resting metabolic rate is a majority of your daily energy need or your total energy expenditure on a given day. Around 60-ish, 70-ish% of your energy for the day is made up by your resting metabolic rate. So it's a big component.
So to help the people that might not have the background, you're always one that's creative and crafty with analogies. Hit them with one so they can wrap their minds around a visual of what's going on.
Yeah, I tried to work through a few analogies in my head to make this make sense a little bit better. The analogies do help, or the visuals are super helpful. So the one I came up with was more or less a boat analogy. So if you could think of your mitochondria as the coolest, most net zero, no fossil fuels, no electric, energy efficient boat. I think we'll stick with a boat in this case. I'm not a submarine expert. I'm not even a boat expert. So in this case, we'll use boat. Seems to be a better idea. So you can think about like if your mitochondria were a boat, and the way that this particular boat operates, you've got your electron transport chain. You can kind of see the gray rectangle on the image. So think about that as more or less a bilge pump, if you're familiar. And maybe again, if you're not like a boat expert, bilge pump is basically a pump that makes sure that your or that your boat doesn't fill up with water, and it will pump water like out of the boat back into the actual surrounding body of water where it belongs. If you're more like a canoe person, think of like people in the canoe and they're scooping water out of your canoe, tossing it back into the lake. So in this case, the boat equals the mitochondria. Electron transport chain is basically the people that's pumping the water out. In this case, the water will function as protons. Your boat is floating on this sea of protons. Another thing for our mitochondria analogy here, ATP synthase is a transporter, but on the boat analogy, you're going to take these hydrogens or these protons and pump it through ATPA synthase from the proton sea that you're floating on, and you're going to generate energy that way. So it's this closed system where your electron transport chain pumps hydrogens, protons out of the boat. The ATPA synthase will pull them in and pass them through like a turbine and generate ATP. And that's kind of the way the mitochondria works. In this case, the water that you pump out, you recycle, and you can generate energy that way as you move throughout the sea. So this is one example, and it's pretty efficient this way. This is a completely coupled, like 100% mitochondrial coupling, right? Every hydrogen or proton you pass through the electron transport chain that goes back through ATP synthase, you will generate ATP and energy at a 1-to-1. So in this case, if we want to take a look at what's uncoupling, what it looks like, it would be closer to this visual here, where in this visual, we've added an uncoupling protein. So UCP, there's more than one uncoupling protein available to us that we will probably discuss. But in this case, this is kind of like a hole in your boat where hydrogens or protons can come through into the hull of the boat, which means your electron transport chain has to pump harder to get more protons out. In doing so, it will generate some energy, and you may have a little bit less hydrogens that are making it all the way around to the ATPA synthase. So we'll kind of keep that in mind. Basically, those uncoupling proteins are, again, kind of like holes in the boat. Now, they're dedicated holes, like holes in your boat there, were channels that will allow only the protons through. An ideal scenario, and it causes your metabolism to work. It causes you to be a little bit less efficient, where before it was just 1-to-1. In this case, there's another way that you're going to get more water in the boat, and it means you have to pump more energy and burn more energy that way. For a more simplistic exercise example, you could think of exercise like walking, right, being more or less mitochondria coupled, where there's not a ton of inefficiency. You're not carrying a lot of extra load. So you can think of walking as being more or less mitochondria coupling versus like rucking or weighted vest or a backpack that you're carrying increases the energy expenditure that you have to do to walk the same distance. Similarly, like sprinting, if you're sprinting in the just air or a hard surface versus sprinting in sand versus sprinting in water, the sand, the water changes the energy dynamics so that it's much more energy inefficient to do the same sprinting work. We'll close out this analogy section for now. Brandon, I'd love to hear if you could take us back to the actual breakdown, and hopefully we'll hit
Yeah,
everybody's.
I like the visual. I appreciate it. I wanted to make sure we succinctly state this for the people who are non-visual learners. As the name suggests, uncoupling, you had to get there at some point, so there must have been a coupling. So there's essentially two parts to this. The coupling part, hooking a protein and oxygen molecule up together. That's it. They get pulled down the electron transport chain, and they're going to go through this turnstile that's called the ATP synthase. Boom, energy. We did that pretty quickly. Sometimes people do not hook up with the correct people. And what we call that in the science case is reactive oxygen species, ROS, or free radicals. So they are the bouncers here trying to get rid of the wrong hookups. Like if you went out with a new person and you can say off the bat, that person's not good for you. You have the good friend there, which is melatonin and glutathione, the antioxidants that are trying to squish down these reactive oxygen species and try to kick them out, break it up. That doesn't always happen. And over time, there's the pressure. We hit the boiling point. All of a sudden, we got to push it out. And that's through those uncoupling proteins that insert themselves into the membrane of the mitochondria and create this funnel that pressure release. And the result ends up being heat production. So, part one, coupling, making energy. Part two, we're dissipating it. There's a trade-off there. You're either making the energy or you're making this heat production through thermogenesis. I don't know that more uncoupling is necessarily better, Rich, and I know you mentioned that with your 0 to 100% analogy earlier, and there's certainly a case that can be made to kind of sit on the maybe lower middle end-ish of this, but fascinating story that kind of illustrates the dangers, which is going to begin with the too much coupling side. So leaning more towards the 100% of uncoupling. There's a synthetic chemical, if you want to call it that, called 2,4-DNP or 2,4-dinitrophenol. But to tie these two together and why it's so historically important and why I can demonstrate the dangers of being extreme in anything, lifestyle, diet, exercise, whatever, adding agents or chemicals to your body. What the 2,4-DNP does is it inserts into the inner mitochondrial membrane and allows these protons through the UCPs to leak back into the matrix without passing through this ATP synthase. The result from this is that the energy from the food that you've eaten is burned off as heat instead of captured as ATP. This kind of represents that, maybe not quite 100%, but extreme uncoupling. Why this became dangerous, for this historical context, there were World War I factory workers making gun stuff for use in the wars. They started to notice that the people working in these factories were losing weight pretty rapidly. Some were losing vision, cataracts, going blind, low grade fever. There were a few other health problems associated. Along with it came weight loss. And so maybe that net positive of going blind or all the other nasty things outweighed it for some people. Not quite my cup of tea, but this was one of the advertisements from the 1930s that showed how powerful this DNP could be for weight loss. Advertised to a lot of women as a quick weight loss drug. Obviously, I think it was successful, but not in the ways that we would want to approach weight loss. And it was sold as a weight loss drug. People lost fat dramatically. The price was high. Overheating, dehydration, heart failure, not cool. Some deaths, certainly from hypothermia, when the metabolic rate just kind of skyrocketed and went up uncontrollably. You might correlate this to another wave, another trend that happened. I think it was 80s, 90s, if I'm correct, for fen-phen, that we're seeking out things to put in our bodies to try to achieve something that could be achieved physiologically, naturally through other mechanisms. There was no really natural break on the DMP, so massive uncoupling. From a dosing standpoint, the window was kind of razor thin between weight loss and the toxic dose. So you can see how that became incredibly dangerous, so much to the point that it was banned by the FDA as of 1938. And it was actually one of the first drugs ever removed from the market for these safety reasons. Despite DNP being dangerous at these high doses with an unbelievable amount of uncoupling, why might at least some uncoupling be more protective?
Yeah, certainly more is not better. As Brandon had mentioned, DNP is a cautionary tale. We'll talk about this. It's fascinating research, and DNP has come to the market and then been removed from the market, but you still see it pop up in the research, so we'll chat about that a little bit. Yeah, some uncoupling's protective. You want some. Primarily, it has a bigger benefits is associated with reactive oxygen species that are associated with aerobic energy production or aerobic cellular respiration using the electron transport chain. When you're doing that, you generate more reactive oxygen species to produce energy that aerobic way, maximizing it in comparison to anaerobic energy production. Energy production generates a whole lot less ROS, but it also generates a whole lot less energy. So in the context of either exercise, getting the most value per unit fuel or per unit glucose or whatever it is that you're burning per unit fat, oxidative phosphorylation, electron transport chain produce more energy. And that's helpful if you're trying to sustain a brain and have a heart that continues to function and think about important topics like this. There's a few things to keep in mind. Again, the ROS is the big one. So we'll put up another visual. Hopefully it'll help make the case. You can see that we have complex 1 through 4 demonstrated on the top left of this mitochondrial model or this mitochondrial visual. And you can see right here would be ATPA synthase with the circle, and you can see ADP going to ATP. So you can see that it generates ATP when you pass these protons through ATPA or ATP synthase. You can also see that through electron transport chain, especially looking at complex 1 and 3 in particular, you see this O2 minus or this super oxide anion. You see hydrogen peroxide, H2O2, and then you see peroxynitrate, which is ONOO minus. See, those are either reactive oxygen species or free radicals that are generated where they have unpaired electrons and it makes them unstable, can damage cellular components, as well as it can have some effect on DNA in the nucleus and cause mutations. Again, some of it's unavoidable, but you don't want too much ROS. The thing that's cool with what you'll see on the right-hand side there, the uncoupling proteins, protein 1, UCP1, 2, 3, and then ANT there, which stands for adenine nucleotide translocase. All of those act as uncoupling for the mitochondria, so they will allow more protons or hydrogens into the mitochondrial membrane, and they immediately match up with these free radicals or these ROS that are generated. You want this baseline level, and you saw it when Brandon discussed the DNP. We need a baseline level outside of our control of some uncoupling. It keeps us not generating too much heat, keeps us from getting hypothermia as well. It keeps ROS at bay and helps our energy equation zero out and meet the demands that we need, especially in the more sedentary state where you have a low energy demand, but you don't want to turn off energy production at the mitochondria at any given point in time. So you want some level of inefficiency going on there. Brandon mentioned there's a trade-off. Trade energy efficiency when you're fully coupled, right? You're super energy efficient. When you're more uncoupled, you're preventing a lot of damage from reactive oxygen species. Keep in mind, touch on scenarios where not only do you have basal uncoupling going on, you want inducible uncoupling, where you can actually do something. DNP, that was inducible uncoupling, where they added this chemical or this synthetic, and it caused the body to uncouple more. It produced more heat, inefficiency, so they're burning more energy. That helped with the weight loss equation. There is some level of energy balance, and the math is hard to avoid. So there is some interest in mitochondrial uncoupling from a weight loss perspective. That continues to this day. But on the exercise side of things, it's really cool. You actually will uncouple less during exercise. During exercise, your energy demand goes way up. You kind of need more ATP generation. You don't want a ton of reactive oxygen species, but in the exercise context, the reactive oxygen species do perform a signaling role to bring some level of recovery and repair to cells, to mitochondria after exercise sessions. So that signal that increases during exercise as you deactivate these uncoupling proteins is a dual benefit when you become a little less inefficient. So when you couple more and uncouple less during exercise so that you generate a 1-to-1 more ATP per proton that you pass through the membrane, then that's a benefit overall. But you don't want to be less energy efficient for sure, and maybe be working on ROS and tamping down ROS, especially in the less energy stress state where you're not exercising when you might be sedentary and things like that. Looking at some of the experimental evidence, some of the cool studies that we were able to dive into in taking a look at this topic in particular, there's some lifestyle things that you can do, which we'll talk about, but there's probably also some protocols. As you know, DNP is not one of the Healthspan protocols. Spoiler alert, if you didn't already know that. We're not offering DNP at this point. I know Brandon also brought up fen. Again, not one we're doing, but GLP-1s is one that we offer it with coaching, and our philosophy is around a minimum effective dose. So with GLP-1, you would be targeting weight loss. I don't think GLP-1s in particular, I guess that'd be interesting to look into. I don't know that that's one of their mechanism of action, but they do address weight loss, and the dose seems to be important there. DMP is still being studied at lower doses. It's kind of fascinating work, but those high doses that they were using back then in the 30s are a problem. I think there's some indication now that it's possible that you can overdo the dosage on a GLP-1, and that lines up with how we're approaching GLP-1s, specifically for weight loss. But are you aware of any of our protocols that do address uncoupling?
Ish. It's not a direct uncoupler, and I think this is important for our patient panel, is that low dose oral rapamycin, low dose and oral weekly of about 3, 4, 5, 6 milligrams, somewhere in that range, probably has some kind of indirect or mild uncoupling downstream effect. A couple reasons for that. We know the whole reason that we're taking the low dose rapamycin is mTOR pathway inhibition. And as a result of putting a little tap on the brakes here and there, is that you have improved mitochondrial function or mitophagy. We probably can understand that mitochondrial function improvement is a good thing. Second reason, I think, is reduced ROS production. So anytime you have that, you have less oxidative damage. Third and final one that I can think of would be that we know mTOR can activate something called AMPK, AMP kinase. We know that AMPK upregulates something called PGC1 alpha, and PGC1 alpha regulates mitochondrial biogenesis. So here we kind of close the loop on that. And that can increase this uncoupling protein or UPC expression in muscle and in fat, which can kind of shift metabolism toward fat oxidation. If you tie in improved body composition, weight loss, anytime you have a shift in fat oxidation increase, you're probably going to end up with a healthier body. Don't have much to say in terms of data in humans, but there was a 2019 study in Cell that used mice and saying that there might be some rapamycin effects on coupling, not direct. When cells are given rapamycin, their mitochondria build up a stronger charge across that inner wall. That proton gradient force increases, like pumping this battery inside the cell, getting ready for it to burst. This points to a possible connection between the process of uncoupling and autophagy, this cellular cleaning process that gets rid of the bad stuff and gets away for the good stuff. Don't really know and can't quite elucidate the exact link, but it likely does involve mTOR, that mTOR pathway, which is that master switch that tells cells when we want to grow, when we want to proliferate, or conversely, when it's time to start autophagy and repairing yourselves a little bit. That experiment I talked about with mice, the mice were given DNP. We know a chemical that can aggressively dose mix the poison, uncouple, but it showed a lower mTOR activity so we're not growing, we're not proliferating and doing ROS production, and more autophagy, so the cellular cleaning. So less of the bad, more of the good going on suggests that their cells probably shifted towards this cleanup process and repair mode versus like a more damaging inability to do better kind of mode. To kind of point out what you said before you pitched it to me, Rich, certainly would go with the low dose oral rapamycin over something like DNP. We'll choose the less deadly, more safer version. But considering this overlap with DNP and rapamycin around the mTOR pathway, are they still doing any research on DNP as a change agent, DNP in general?
They are certainly doing that. Some more recent data, probably button up DNP, but there was one 2021 study in birds, finch. This was basically like the graphical abstract they provided. Wasn't super favorable results looking at DNP. Anytime you're like targeting mTOR, right? The rapamycin data looks really good on longevity and lifespan extension in animal models and some low dose cyclic stuff, like the way that we do it at Healthspan. There's promising evidence associated with that too, from a lifespan and a Healthspan side of things for rapamycin. On DNP, at least at this dose, it was a long-term study looking at zebra finches to see what happens to their lifespan. They noticed that it was a 21% reduction in lifespan associated with a fairly large dose, 4 milligrams per kilogram per day in terms of relative dose. DNP is not the way to go in terms of targeting mTOR. Rapamycin is probably better. Obviously, there's some uncoupling going on, but DNP, at least at the high dose range, might be overdoing the uncoupling. And I think that's the root of issues with DNP. And so fast forward, right, after that data, there have been some more recent studies. There's even a 2025 more recent study where they were looking at a DNP microdose. Instead of being the 4 milligrams per kilogram per day, they were looking at 0.5 to 1 milligram per kilogram per day. The human dose equivalent, in this case, they were doing a mouse study. Converting that would be like 2.5 to 5 milligrams a day. Much lower dosages. Mouse study results weren't quite as bad as the Finch study, which is good. I'm not trying to argue that anyone immediately go locate some DNP and get to work utilizing that as a longevity agent. Given our focus around health span and longevity, there's probably, at this point in time, much better strategies to do that. There's other chemicals, other medications, ways of inducing uncoupling. DNP will induce uncoupling, but it does it in a way that's not really good brakes for the mechanism on DNP at this point, from what we know. So maybe there's something else. Brandon, what else do you know of since we're taking this?
I swear we'll get off chemicals at some point and get to the actual things that are fun, like diet and exercise and lifestyle and whatever else. But never thought I would be discussing this one, especially in a health and longevity space. So I'll give you a second to sit down. But nicotine. Somehow we came across that nicotine is also an uncoupler and has some uncoupling value. Now, this is again mouse studies, and they injected them subcutaneously for 2 weeks. I believe it was 0.4 milligrams per kilogram of body weight. But it seemed to upregulate this UCP1, which we know upregulates brown adipose tissue thermogenesis. And in these mices, it reduced body weight. So we're starting to see a pattern here with the nicotine, the DNP, the fen-phen, maybe the GLP-1. If you were to extrapolate another thing that's very popular in culture right now and look at lifestyle, the ZYNs, the little nicotine pouches that people are putting in their lip, has about 3 to 6 milligrams of nicotine in it. If you were to dose match that from what the mice had at that point, 0.4 milligrams, to what a ZYN's like, that would be about 25 to 30 milligrams of nicotine. And unfortunately, what we would consider a potentially lethal overdose situation for nicotine is about 30 to 60 milligrams. So again, dose makes the poison. I'm not quite recommending any of these things, but to point out that there apparently are a lot of things that can uncouple. We got way deep in things as we started unpacking this, and I know you found another cool one too.
Tried to be as comprehensive as we could. Uncoupling seems like you have a little bit less control there. Maybe there's some genetic influences, which might come up later. There does seem to be some genetic variability in uncoupling protein content associated with mitochondria, brown adipose tissue, and things across the human population. So you immediately look to inducible uncoupling. Like, what can I do to help myself uncouple better? That is a active area of research, as it turns out. Still, there was at least 3 other ones that I'll just briefly bring up. Forgive me in terms of some of the naming structure here. So the first one that was kind of listed, right, with DNP, there's a couple other ones that came up. Carbonyl cyanide, p-triofluoryl methoxyphenylhydrazone.
You nailed it.
I've been working on that all day yesterday and all day last night. So either way, acronym for that makes no sense. It's FCCP. I don't know. In addition, carbonyl cyanide 3 chlorophenylhydrazone, CCCP. They're 2 classic mitochondrial uncouplers that are referred to as being most used in the research. So these are agents that would help you induce uncoupling. Some of these are like only for research uses. They are protonophores. If you think about the boat analogy, it's kind of like if you brought Elmer Fudd onto the boat and he's like shooting holes in your boat. And that's what these protonophores do. It's potentially dangerous to have too many holes in the boat. It's different when uncoupling protein's there because, again, it's like letting a controlled amount. It's very different than arbitrarily putting a bunch of holes in the boat. So this means that when you have holes in your boat, your mitochondrial membrane, protons can get in. So that helps with energy and efficiency, certainly will contribute to uncoupling, but it's not all that can get in. So in this case, when you activate some of these protonophores, they put holes in the mitochondrial membrane, or they allow for more movement through the membrane space. The reason you have membranes to begin with is you want to keep things in that should be in, and you want to keep things out that should be out. And then if you want to let things in, you've got like this ATP synthase where you're like leveraging that in traveling proton and you're getting energy out of it. When it's just a hole and things just fly in and out, they notice that things like calcium can actually move in and out of the cell too readily, and it'll impact your nerve depolarizations. It'll cause you to have a metabolic shift, and the negative components of too much uncoupling can happen. Those are 2 additional interesting ones. Keep that in mind. keep some of these, the way these things work, these protonophores are not like uncoupling proteins. They're a little less selective. It's just putting holes in the bottom of your boat in terms of your membrane, your mitochondrial membrane space. This is going to be like a dramatic shift here where I go from like DNP, not so great. Brandon also agrees with me there. FCCP, CCCP, maybe a little bit too casual about the way that they're pushing holes in the bottom of our membrane or boat at our mitochondria. Now, there's another one by acronym of BAM15, and that one, I did look up the name. I'm not even going to attempt to verbalize the name. We're just going to call it BAM15. This is a newer, promising uncoupler on the block. The data looks promising. It's newer in comparison to like the DNPs and the other guys. The mouse data shows in a head-to-head comparison study, it's the same type of idea. It helps with becoming more energy inefficient. So for weight loss and some of these things, even for glycemic control, there's some really cool data. We still have some questions about the safety profile, especially in humans with regard to BAM15. It does look like you can get on Amazon. I'm not saying that you should do that. As of right now, this is not approved for human outside of research, from what I could tell. And I haven't even found any human research at this point. But there was one 2024 study in mice where they were comparing head-to-head BAM15 with a 60% calorie-restricted diet. I guess there's like the Minnesota starvation or semi-starvation calorie restriction study. Like there's some studies where they got really high calorie restriction. I don't think the results were very good in those cases. In mice, they're trying this just as proof of concept. They added semaglutide or a GLP-1 and medications or chemicals. BAM15 and high calorie restriction, 60%, improved body weight and liver steatosis or fatty liver. According to the data, was superior to the semaglutide. In this head-to-head comparison, BAM15 plus, again, the CR would be crazy. The calorie restriction probably doesn't translate to humans. At 60% calorie restriction just doesn't work well for humans. That was really interesting. In addition, BAM15 plus the GLP-1 improved glucose tolerance in a more similar or matched way. So it kind of matches the GLP-1 effects on the glucose side of things. Finally, BAM15, again, matched with semaglutide, calorie restriction included, did help with hypertriglyceridemia or high triglyceride levels. I guess the reason BAM15 is cool, or the reason these uncouplers are cool, they just work differently. So they increase your burn rate, or they're making you inefficient through mitochondrial uncoupling. But at any given point in time, if Brandon right now is burning, 12 or 15 calories a minute to hang out here, the mitochondrial uncoupler or some inducible mitochondrial uncoupling that's taking place, maybe he's burning 20, 25, 30 calories per minute just hanging out doing nothing. You're just spinning that wheel faster, or that flywheel, if you will. Weight loss is not more energy necessarily as the primary method. It's usually like, how do we get people to eat less? Bariatric surgery cause the stomach to be smaller. Or the GLP-1s, one of the primary modes is that they decrease or delay gastric emptying, which means you're not as hungry, so you eat less. It's always like on the eat less, the incoming energy side. These uncouplers are on the side of let's just burn more. And maybe it's fascinating. I'm interested to follow BAM15 closely to see when the human data comes out. It was exciting to find BAM15 as we were prepping for this.
Well, you either made a lot of friends or lost a lot of friends by sharing that BAM15 outperformed GLP-1s.
It was only like the one head-to-head mouse study. It was only with body weight and NAFLD or like the liver. I guess NAFLD is like an outdated term. So like the MASH, I guess is what it's called. So yeah, it was only in that like one thing, that one bullet associated with one study. I'm not saying that this is better, that we got it all wrong, that we need to do everything differently. I've never heard of BAM15 up until this topic of discussion came up. And when I learned about it, I thought it was really cool. It's worth watching for. If you're interested in health and longevity, I would watch for BAM15 results, especially in humans, to come out.
Okay. And we'll report back once there is. Stamp on chemicals and agents at this point and move into what is, I would consider, more of a applicable kind of thing for people to take away and how they can uncouple in their daily life versus taking some more stuff. And we know that there's a spectrum at this point of very, very drastic uncouplers, mild, and maybe minimal uncouplers. So I think we came up with about 3.5 buckets for what we want to talk about. The first one being lifestyle, and I'm sure that's going to include the cold exposure, which is probably the one that people are most familiar with, the people that understand why they're doing cold plunges and cold immersion stuff. Second one being diet, nutrition. Third one being physical activity, exercise, half genetic variability, because that's not really something you can do. You just kind of got that, and it is what it is. Coming back to that first one, let's talk lifestyle and cold exposure.
That one seems to be the one that comes up most readily when you start inquiring about mitochondrial uncoupling. As you enter into that rabbit hole, you'll notice you're greeted by cold research. You're quickly going to see that there's some brown adipose tissue discussion happening. You're going to see the terms uncoupling protein, UCP1, UCP2. Cold does seem to increase uncoupling. There's legitimate research at this point. The thing that you should just be aware of in terms of the cold exposure, the data looks really good. Uncoupling and supporting brown adipose tissue transition or activation is super important. To keep in mind with this research, usually links cold exposure and UCP1, which is good. That's a strong uncoupling protein based on the name. I would assume it's the first uncoupling protein that we discovered, probably because it's the most active. In order to actually affect mitochondrial uncoupling, you have to express UCP1. It's got to be in the mitochondria and it's got to be active. You can express a lot of UCP1, but if it's not activated, then you're not getting a whole lot of benefit out of your UCP1. Cold helps to activate UCP, brown adipose tissue. If you're unfamiliar with what brown adipose tissue is, you have different types of adipose tissue. You have white and you have brown. There's this middle transition state where they call it beige adipose tissue. And this does, it's important because brown adipose tissue is metabolically active, way more metabolically active than white adipose tissue. The primary role is to store lipids, store fats, great source of energy, super energy dense. But the brown adipose tissue has a lot of mitochondria, also has UCP1 abundant. You have to have the mitochondria, have the UCP1 there, and then when you activate this, you are turning on your mitochondria in that fat depot, and it ends up burning energy. A lot of it's through energy inefficiency, uncoupling, because you want to release and improve some of the heat release so you can counteract cold exposure. There is a decline. There's shifts throughout your lifespan, for example, around brown adipose tissue, and generally there's more brown adipose tissue and it becomes more beige and then more white over time as you age. Cold exposure does seem to shift that. There's been some interesting human trials. Cold exposure doesn't mean you have to go get a freezer and fill it with water and turn on the freezer and break the ice so that you can get in every day. That is a popular way to do it. Some of these studies are just looking at cold exposure in terms of being in an air-conditioned room, which I thought was fascinating and much more approachable than the cold water immersion. So you can get cold exposure across a variety of ways without having to go with full cold water immersion. Although I do agree that you're probably tougher if you do the cold water immersion than if you just sit in the air-conditioned room in a t-shirt. So I'll pause there, Brandon. If there's anything in particular, we're not quite done with cold exposure, but I wanted to make sure that
I guess at least postulate or speculate, especially in the context of 0 to 100% here. Would you do this for an hour a day? Would you do this twice a week? I don't know if you have data on that, and I'm not asking you to, but this may be like a what you would do kind of thing.
Okay, it's a fair question. So yeah, the one study that comes to mind that I looked at a little bit more extensively, you can find the cold water stuff in the literature for sure, where you're going to be in the very cold water and you got to get up to at least your neck. And we'll kind of talk about that. It should make sense in just a moment. But you're going to do that for a few minutes. Maybe you're going to do it once a day. Seems like the research indicates you should probably do it towards the morning, and then you probably don't want to do it immediately after exercise. Then you have to place that and you have to be mentally strong enough to do it. I've tried some of that and I don't enjoy it. Maybe I didn't do it consistently enough. I'm on my own health and longevity journey and I'm just not leveled up enough to do the cold water immersion every day. So yeah, there was one study, it was a 2013 study, but then there was actually several follow-up studies associated with this particular exposure testing that they've done. In this case, they did a 2-hour daily exposure at roughly 17 degrees C or 19 degrees C. They also did a FDG-PET, which I know we brought up FDG-PET in previous episodes. Basically, this is a really cool way of measuring metabolic activity in the body. They do it for tumors and cancer patients and trying to locate tumors. You can also do it for brown adipose tissue to see when this is more active. If you look at the image here, you can see where they did a comparison. This is the acute changes. They've done some 6-week studies where they showed that there was an increase in brown adipose tissue. There's also associated significant decrease in body fat mass when you do 6 weeks of this daily exposure of 2 hours of cold. So in this case, this is just the acute look at the FDG-PET. So 2 hours in either 27 degrees Celsius, 80 degrees Fahrenheit versus 19 degrees in this case, which was about 66 degrees Fahrenheit, just a t-shirt. And you can kind of see in the image, Brandon, I know you have experience with FDG-PET. You can see the brain. The brain is the gigantic, very metabolically active spherical thing going on in the person's head, obviously very clear and visual. You can see for the 80 degrees Fahrenheit, you can see the heart, kind of that oblong, slightly oblique or angled organ in the middle of the chest. The left side, you can see along the spine, right in the middle of the torso, and where like the collarbones would be, very dark there. It's lit up, as they say, but it's actually black in the FDG-PET. That symbolizes the activity of the brown adipose tissue, and that's where it's located in the body. So in terms of like cold water exposure, if you only put your feet in the cold water, you're not really getting the benefit as much as you could. That's why with the cold water, you want to at least go up to your neck. You got to get that region of the body in the water. The one thing to keep in mind is with this cold exposure, this was only 66 degrees. Make sure we point that out. It doesn't have to be ridiculous cold in this case. It was 2 hours long, so I guess if you really want to go way lower on the temperature, way shorter on the duration, maybe the cold water is the way to go. But in this case, 66 degrees, air-conditioned room. They were doing some interesting things with like setting their legs on ice, on and off, like 4 minutes on, alternating. They weren't wearing anything like shorts and t-shirt according to the study, but I found it quite fascinating. There is some level of like you want to have non-shivering thermogenesis. So if you are shivering, you've kind of like passed the threshold of like this brown adipose because now you're activating the muscles to generate energy. You want to be not quite shivering. The brown adipose tissue is generating extra heat and that's getting it done. If you move into the shivering range, your body says, there's not enough heat here. We need to go to the shivering to generate heat by activating the muscle, just like exercise. Exercising without exercising, shivering. And VO2 max data supports that your VO2 max, if it's normally around 3.5 milliliters per kilogram per minute, when you're shivering, it can be like close to 20. That's a big VO2 max for just kind of sitting there tremoring.
I think that's an excellent
Or I
marker.
guess, yeah. Not VO2 max, sorry, I misspoke. It's a big VO2 metric, sorry. What was that?
I was going to say that's a pretty good metric for people to assess the temperature if they are going to explore the cold exposure, that point between shivering and crossing over the threshold.
Uncomfortable, but not shivering.
I remember this was probably back in the 90s when there was not social media and iPhones in your face. Even NFL players after games, the reporters would be in there and they were chilling in these huge, huge ice baths. And you could see the ice overflowing, so you would imagine it was probably pretty freezing. At that point, they're using it for pain reduction, inflammation reduction, and getting ready to recover and play again in another day or two after getting their bodies destroyed for 3 or 4 hours. So I don't know if they were necessarily using it for uncoupling, but I guess there was another component of inflammation reduction, ROS reduction at that point, or just to numb the muscles. I don't know.
I think it was that. And the more recent research, although it probably makes you feel less inflamed and probably makes you feel better and maybe your joints are a little bit, I think they were doing it for those reasons. My understanding on the cold water in particular and the really cold stuff like 50 degrees, 40 degrees or less in terms of temperature Fahrenheit, if you do it right after your exercise, you do blunt the adaptation capacity from that exercise because you tamp down the signal for repair and recovery. An effective strategy for some things, but I don't know that it's maybe, I don't know if I'd call it debunked, but I think it's lost its luster in terms of immediately after the workout going and getting in the, maybe it helped, like I know for, after a leg day, that the hanging out in the ice bath, whatever, that seemed to help. At least with being able to walk up the stairs the next day. But it might not help in the long term for muscle adaptations.
All right, so that was cold exposure stuff. I want to move on to the next one, which is more diet and nutrition focused. What I would imagine falls into this diet nutrition bucket is calorie restriction, intermittent fasting, and you talked about things that you can do nothing and have mild uncoupling going on. Potentially high protein diet, which I would think may upregulate some of the uncoupling proteins and increase the proton leak. But let's start with the calorie restriction.
It does look like there are some broadly on the nutrition side of the house. Most of the research I was seeing, instead of targeting UPC1, seems like UPC3 comes up in the literature more so. Now, I don't know maybe the specifics there, if UPC1 is a more potent uncoupler than UPC3, but it does seem like on the nutrition side, UPC3 is more the target in terms of what they're recording and measuring. So my hypothesis at this point is that it's slightly less impactful than like the cold exposure on the nutrition side of things. For calorie restriction, some benefits, particularly activating UPC3. That's what I've seen in the literature. You have to activate UPC3 in the mitochondria for it to actually be able to do any uncoupling. So it seems like you're on the right track there. There might be some benefits. Within the intermittent fasting space, there was quite a few studies, but the one that stuck out was actually back to 1986. They show a reduction in UPC or uncoupling protein activity generally. This actually tends to make sense, in my opinion, if you're getting a lot of signals that there's not abundant energy levels, that your body probably compensates by being more efficient, not less efficient. So uncoupling proteins, uncoupling means that you're going to burn more energy as heat and not make energy out of it as you would otherwise. In the fasted state, I don't think you, at least in the short term or during the fast, want to be just burning energy. I think your body has like too many safety mechanisms to support life. There was some interesting research where during the refeed, which is very crucial, like if you're going to do an intermittent fast, your refeed is actually just as important, if not more important than the fast. The fast produces a signal. It's kind of like, I think they say the same thing with exercise. I guess Brandon and I are exercise science bros. Is nutrition interested or oriented? Like the training is one thing, but if you do beautiful training, but your recovery is so bad that you just can't really adapt and the changes that you need to support the training and get better, it's similar to that with intermittent fasting. Like you want to refeed well. With a good refeed, it does seem like you can bring online the UPC activity again and recover that. If you've down-regulated uncoupling, you just bring it back online. Good to know.
To double click on that, either caloric restriction or lower fuel availability, even the smallest kind of fast, like 12 hours. We know lower fuel availability, we start to tinker with that AMP ATP ratio, and we already talked about AMP kinase and how that promotes that mitochondrial biogenesis. So we know that that works. And at that point, depending on how long the fast is and what you potentially had eaten before, ketone production goes up. BHB or beta hydroxybutyrate, we're going to move in that way. And so changing that mitochondrial energy level redox balance has increased that proton leak, and that's what this is all about with the uncoupling.
On the topic of ketones, keto did pop up within the diet space, although Brandon and I might be considered biased towards keto. I wasn't going out looking for keto in this case, but it does seem like there's some mouse data. There was a 2022 review that I was looking at. So at least in mice, there's some reliable evidence that UPC3 is active in association with ketogenic diets and maybe associated with some of the pathways, some of the biochemistry that Brandon just pointed out. I cannot definitively say whether that's the same in humans. I think the jury's still out. The mouse data does demonstrate that there's some UCP3 activation with keto in particular. High protein diet was one. I actually thought this one was going to be all over the place in terms of like, I wasn't going to be able to type in the word uncoupling without high protein diet in nutrition space coming up pretty regularly. That's not what I saw. Now, I do know that protein is energetically inefficient from a metabolism side of things in terms of breaking down protein. There's a thermogenesis effect there because you have to first deal with the nitrogen in an amino acid from protein source before you can pull the energy out, versus carbs and fats. You do not have any nitrogen that you have to deal with first, so you get more energy per unit carb or fat just readily out instead of having to do the prep work to deaminate. I did not see any uncoupling benefits associated with high protein diet. I think it's a different pathway, but that can help with satiety and it can help with total energy expenditure, but it may not be a mitochondrial uncoupling pathway in that case. What about one thing I didn't look into as much was the nutrient modulation, the micronutrients, specific vitamins, minerals. Is there anything else that pops up in the literature based on your assessment?
You probably could have said yes without even doing any research, and I swore we were done with DNP, but I totally lied. Because what does DNP stand for is dinitrofenol. So we know it's some kind of phenol, and we know that polyphenols are pretty good for us. So things like resveratrol, the catechins that you can find in teas, green teas, the chlorogenic acid that we can find in coffees, mild uncouplers. They still do it to some degree, but it's a healthy, probably optimizing thing to add to your regimen or your diet in some capacity, they create this very small increase in this proton leak. And if you compare DNP to something like drinking a green tea, we're talking about poking a pinhole in a balloon versus firing a rocket into the side of a dam kind of thing. Way different.
Okay, so
All right.
yeah, context is important.
It's
Or like
important.
the magnitude of effect is important to keep in mind.
All right. So we've done lifestyle cold exposure stuff. We've done some of the nutritional approaches to this. And then number 3 is exercise. Endurance training, maybe. Resistance training. I don't know if we have anything to talk about with uncoupling and if that's happening during, after, anything like that.
A lot of this has to do on the exercise side of things, for example, consistent training, physical activity, endurance training in particular. If you're operating at that low to moderate intensity, you are going to have an adaptation where you're having an increase in mitochondrial mass or content of mitochondria in your skeletal muscles because of the fiber type that you're targeting. I know we looked into this a little bit, but the mitochondrial content of your type 1 muscle fibers, the muscle fibers that are most active when you're doing endurance training, they're fatigue resistant and they have a preference for using aerobic energy production mechanisms, meaning electron transport chain, going through oxidative phosphorylation. These ones have higher mitochondrial content. And to target them, you do a little bit lower intensity training, but you do it for a longer duration of time. There is some data to indicate that if you have a basal level of uncoupling that's happening all the time, let's say your baseline uncoupling is 5% across all your mitochondria at any given point in time, your total capacity to be inefficient, to burn energy, to do the uncoupling is derived by how much mitochondria content you have present in your body. Endurance training, by increasing the number of mitochondria that you have, the density of the mitochondria content in any unit muscle. If you were to do a biopsy of a muscle and you had 100 grams of muscle that you're looking at, the trained person, especially the endurance trained person, will have more mitochondria per 100 grams of muscle than would the sedentary or the less trained person. By increasing the number of mitochondria, like retirement accounts, if you have a small amount of money and you get a 5% return, your overall return is not great. But if you have a huge account for retirement, that 5% is just a bigger absolute number. So it's that type of scenario on the mitochondrial side with uncoupling and exercise. Physical activity has the opposite effect in terms of reducing mitochondrial uncoupling capacity in skeletal muscles in humans. Be consistent with your exercise or at least your movement. Even unstructured movement is fine. Doing anything where you're telling your muscles, give me energy, make energy, produce energy to meet this physical demand is a good idea. High intensity work doesn't necessarily change the number of mitochondria considerably, like the endurance signal would produce, but it does change the capacity of each mitochondria for generating. It just improves the overall function of mitochondria to do the higher intensity stuff. So don't shy away from the high intensity stuff. You want to have a lot of highly functional mitochondria at any given point in time if you want to try to maximize uncoupling.
The most unmodifiable of the 3 is going to be the genetic variability. Generations that have lived in Alaska or Antarctica or something that's really cold is probably going to be different to somewhere like Africa or something that's really warm, and activity levels are different. I guess there was probably some physiological adaptations, some evolution associated with that. So how does genetic variation play into longevity, I guess?
There's, as we kind of hinted, there's certainly polymorphisms amongst the genes for the uncoupling protein. Genetically, you could just be one of those people that has a high baseline for uncoupling in terms of how much uncoupling protein is expressed in your mitochondria. I did see there was a PLOS1. I don't even know if I'm supposed to say it. It's an interesting journal name. It was an older study from 2011, but they did look at polymorphisms in uncoupling proteins, and there was some geographic relationship there, but it didn't seem to be like you'd wonder if it was like a latitude-based thing, like you said, the cold weather regions. Maybe if your ancestors are from there or something like that, maybe you have more uncoupling protein capacity. That does seem like that hypothesis is pretty common amongst some of the research I was looking at. They're looking at those things like we talked about with the inducing uncoupling. Certainly the lifestyle stuff is worth doing. Those medications, protocols, DNP do maybe have a role when it comes to some of the genetic stuff that you don't have as much control over. Certainly maximize what you can get out of your genes, and epigenetics potentially would be at play. There was some really cool research around brown adipose tissue, because that is something that you can train. You can increase the amount of brown adipose tissue that you do have and the activity of your uncoupling protein in that brown adipose tissue. I did see that was generationally passed down. So if Brandon gets really excited about this cold exposure stuff and makes a consistent habit of doing that, some of the studies were only 6 weeks long, but if you were consistent about doing some of that work, my understanding from the research is that you would increase your brown adipose tissue activity, or even the amount of brown adipose tissue that you do have. And some of those signals can pass down to your offspring. I know mitochondrial DNA, I think, usually comes from the mom. So I don't know how successful Brandon would be in terms of sending that coding down. I don't know if there's a possibility there, which would be a topic for another time. It makes a difference if you're the dad or the mom in terms of increasing brown adipose to benefit your future children or grandchildren. It was a really cool study that I did find in the genetic context of this.
The couple that cold plunges together stays together, so why not do it for both and guarantee that the future generations are going to have tons of brown adipose tissue? Let's wrap up these actionable takeaways. What would Brandon and Rich do? The first one is everything in moderation, including moderation. Throw in things like caloric restriction or small fasting window here and there, sprinkle it in, moderate that cold exposure. I wouldn't do it every day for long periods of time. You don't want to lose a toe or something like that. Avoid overfeeding, because that's going to also overactivate that mTOR pathway, which we know is a growth proliferation pathway. What can you think of?
I wanted to piggyback on your point a little bit that the mitohormesis is at play whenever you do some of these lifestyle stressors, for example. Some fasting, like Brandon has said, or moderate cold exposure, however you like to approach that and put that into action. You can't overdo it. So the whole concept of mitohormesis is that you're going to provide a moderate or mild stress, and then you're going to allow time for adaptation and recovery. As a result, your mitochondria, in this case, mitohormesis, they get better, they adapt, they improve. So certainly do what Brandon says there on the lifestyle side. Look into the research for yourself and confirm if you would like to do that. We always recommend that as well. Watch out for the protonophores. I don't think it's that hard to watch out for all of them, because some of them are banned or some of them are research only and that type of thing. You just don't want to do too much uncoupling. Some too much, too little is not good when it comes to mitochondrial uncoupling. Mitochondrial uncoupling to survive, it makes a whole lot of sense to me, at least at this point, because you could certainly not survive with too little, and you could certainly also not survive with too much uncoupling. So you're looking for more of this Goldilocks zone on the uncoupling. Pass it back over to you, Brandon.
Yeah, I think the last one I have is, and this is tough, but I don't want to belabor this point, but track progress where you can. This is not an easy one, and nobody wants to take a biopsy and hack some muscle out of their quad, but are you feeling fatigued? Are you recovering slower than you used to? Are you feeling great? There's certainly markers of oxidative stress, but not something that I think is going to zero in and give you a very concrete answer, but kind of feeling how your body's doing, correlated to what a normal exercise routine or diet routine or sleep routine has been like for you. Just kind of stay in tune with yourself. Rich, if you have more objective things than that, I know that's kind of
a big fan of tracking progress wherever you can. That looks different for different subjects. And in this case, for this topic of discussion, mitochondrial uncoupling, going to be a little bit more challenging. So even in the research, for humans especially, it's hard to track mitochondrial uncoupling on a whole systemic level. They might excise some cells, some muscle, for example, as Brandon mentioned. We showed an image of the FDG-PET where they were zeroing in on brown adipose tissue, seeing when that was active according to different interventions with temperature. Those are things that probably are out of reach for most people. I don't think I'm stretching it by saying that. I'm not sure how many people are doing FDG-PETs or muscle biopsies regularly. Alternatively, there was some studies where I was looking at, both in mice, but potentially in human, you could look at resting metabolic rate. Mitochondrial uncoupling accounts for 30 to 50% of your resting metabolic rate. A pretty good portion of your energy expenditure at rest. Might be a proxy measure for uncoupling. Depend on your lean mass. If you're 40% body fat versus 15% body fat, but total body weight is the same, the RMR would likely be considerably higher for the person with more lean mass. The person with the 15% body fat has higher lean mass or higher muscle mass. Muscle has a much higher density of mitochondria. We talked about the endurance training. You can increase the amount of mitochondria in your muscle by doing endurance training. If you increase total muscle, you can increase mitochondria if you're exchanging muscle for fat. The research suggests that in those type 1 muscle fibers, if you're aerobically trained, you might have 10%, 20% of the muscle fiber weight would be mitochondria, versus white fat cells, it might be 1% or less than 1%. That's one way to increase your mitochondria, which if you have a basal level of mitochondrial uncoupling, you'll increase your uncoupling by increasing your muscle mass, which maybe that's not like a really super groundbreaking idea that like you could measure your RMR or look at your body composition as proxy measurements outside of doing other intensive research or laboratory-based assessments. That might be one of the better ones. There's probably some labs that you could look at as well associated with inflammation. And if you have more uncoupling, you should have less reactive oxygen species, right? Maybe you're going to have a little less inflammation, maybe CRPs. Like there's different ways that you might be able to look at this on a lab panel as well. It's definitely something we would be fascinated to help take a look at potentially. Although again, it's a little bit obtuse to do so. I guess one area that we might be familiar with is MeScreen. Brandon, I don't know if you were going to bring up MeScreen or not.
I think it's a pretty cool product and it has pretty profound results. You take a little finger stick, just like you would test your blood sugar, and you drop it on a card and send it out to a lab, and they run a 15, 20 biomarkers through that are very strongly correlated with how the mitochondria are performing. So they kind of stress these cells and make them angry. How are you responding to that? How well are you performing? How's your oxidative capacity? Things like that.
There's a mitochondrial efficiency measurement that's probably aligned with what we're talking about here, because we're talking about energy inefficiency as a result of doing more uncoupling. So yeah, MeScreen is an interesting one to consider. Would be worth having, like, if you're super interested in this topic and want to invest in that, would be an option. Again, with any of these tracking progress, we always like to provide like, here's the very little or zero cost option, and here's the moderate. And so the MeScreen is going to move you up in the cost department. Probably one of the better non-research focused commercially available options that we're aware of at this point in time. There's MitoSwab as well. That one has some peer-reviewed publications associated with it. It focuses on complex 1 through 4, so I don't know if it does as well. It's kind of looking at the electron transport chain a little bit more than it is looking at like this uncoupling or the total mitochondria energy efficiency and stuff. So I think MeScreen probably does level up above even some of the other measurements.
To compare the two, the MitoSwab is a cheek swab.
Yep.
And then you send that out versus a finger stick.
It was an absolute pleasure. Before we wrap up, I just want to say we appreciate you guys spending your time with us today. We hope that this is valuable to you. We know that your time means a lot. It's a finite resource, so we're appreciative that you choose to spend it with us. Thank you again for comments. If there's any topics you want us to take a look at, enjoy that. It's really cool to have that bi-directional communication with the community. Thank you so much, everybody.
So that's it, y'all, for this episode of Beyond Healthspan. We hope that you're walking away with some new insights, hopefully a little bit of inspiration for your own healthspan journey to live better, longer, and without the guesswork. If this did spark something for you, please do share it with a friend, drop us a comment, or let us know what you want to explore next. We are here to build a community that's curious about living longer and better, and we are glad that you are part of it.